Check. Get out of here quick.
Meeting will come to order. Today, the committee considers three bipartisan pieces of legislation. The first bill we will be considering is H.R. 3125, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act, which I introduced with Chairman Boucher, Ranking Members Barton and Stearns last year, and I'm pleased that 21 additional members of the Energy and Commerce Committee have signed on as co-sponsors of this important bill. This timely legislation creates a process for the full inventory, mapping, and accounting of current spectrum use by federal and non-federal users. It will inject transparency into the way our government and the private sector utilizes critical public resources. I therefore consider this bill one of the most important pieces of legislation we will consider this year. With the benefit of the inventory and mapping of the spectrum, we can make informed, rational, and deliberate decisions about how our spectrum is used in future decades to benefit the American people, American business, and American innovation. We will consider an amendment in the nature of a substitute with changes that address most of the concerns about the spectrum inventory identified by the Obama administration in its letter to the committee earlier this week. Most importantly, the amendment in the nature of a substitute contains a more robust national security section reflecting the result of extensive bipartisan consultation with the defense and intelligence communities. Among other things, the bill now allows the head of an affected federal agency to determine whether the release of certain spectrum data would be detrimental to national security and homeland security. Moreover, under the revised bill, the head of the federal agency will also be able to make such a determination for spectrum held by non-federal licenses but used for an important national security or homeland security related purpose. The amendment in the nature of a substitute also creates a process under which the National Telecommunications Information Administration, NTIA, and the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, must consult with the National Security Council, the NSC, to allow for the review of the information being collected in the aggregate prior to any public release. This will address a key concern of the intelligence community and I believe strikes a proper balance between providing useful information to the public while safeguarding national security interests. The second bill we'll be considering is H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act of 2009, introduced by Representative Inslee and Upton. Although I support strongly the goals of this bill, the administration has identified several issues of concern, and I'm committed to working closely with the administrations and members of this committee to address these concerns prior to floor consideration. Specifically, we will need to address whether the agencies have adequate resources to plan properly for relocation once suitable spectrum has been identified. Adequate resources are critical for the agencies to produce accurate cost estimates and relocation schedules, including the ability to design and develop the equipment necessary for new spectrum frequencies. In addition, we need to consider whether the agencies have the ability to upgrade their capabilities as part of a relocation process. It would not make sense to require agencies performing critical government functions to be saddled with outdated or inefficient technology. And finally, we need to improve the so-called early entry process to ensure that auction winners and the agencies have more certainty regarding timing and process. We need to allow companies access to purchase spectrum as quickly as possible, but we also need to allow federal agencies clear guidelines as to what we expect from them. The final bill we will consider today is H.R. 1258, the Truth in Caller ID Act of 2009, introduced by Representative Engel and Ranking Member Barton. H.R. 1258 would protect against a practice commonly referred to as caller ID spoofing, where a caller falsifies the original caller ID information associated with a phone call for fraudulent or deceptive purposes. This legislation recognizes there are legitimate business services that change caller ID information and directs the FCC to implement rules in a fashion that allows such services to continue while making fraudulent and deceptive caller ID manipulation unlawful. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Boucher, Ranking Member Barton, Ranking Member Stearns, and their staffs These measures were the result of a collaborative effort, and I greatly appreciate their contributions. I want to now recognize Mr. Stearns for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm substituting for the ranking member, Joe Barton, who will be with us shortly. Thank you for holding this hearing. I think all of us on this side are pleased with this markup. We support the manager's amendment to H.R. 3125, and our staff and your staff have worked together in a bipartisan fashion, which I think is an indication of good work. And we look forward to the H.R. 3019, where you've indicated that the President has some concerns about this bill, and we certainly want to work with you. We'd like to pass it, obviously, out of the full House Energy and Commerce Committee today, and then we can move forward once we get to the floor. The spectrum bills are positive steps forward in promoting good spectrum management. I think you've said that. H.R. 3125 requires the NTIA and the FCC to conduct an inventory of radio spectrum, a very critical first step in identifying additional spectrum that might be used for wireless broadband. H.R. 3019 improves the existing process by which we pay to simultaneously upgrade and relocate federal agencies' spectrum resources in exchange for clearing spectrum for commercial use. Mr. Chairman, I'm a co-sponsor of both pieces of legislation. Now, it's clear that the United States will need additional spectrum to meet the growing demand for wireless broadband. In fact, we are a victim of our own success. The United States currently leads the world in wireless. Wireless providers have used spectrum to provide U.S. consumers with innovative voice and data services. The number of mobile voice customers in the United States has surpassed the number of wireline customers, and the number of mobile broadband customers has increased exponentially over the past several years. As customers increase the amount of time they spend on their mobile devices, talking, emailing, and surfing the Internet, cell sites become constrained because of this capacity. As a result, we are facing, in the words of FCC Chairman Janikowski, quote, a looming spectrum crisis, end quote. For example, a voice call requires approximately 10,000 bits per second, while uploading and downloading video requires millions of bits per second. So in order to increase the amount of spectrum available for commercial mobile services, the administration and the FCC need to inventory the current uses of spectrum bands, especially those below 3 gigahertz that are ideal for mobile services. The bottom line is that we need to know who uses which spectrum bands and the purposes for which they use such bands. Once we have the answers to those questions, the government needs to decide whether to reallocate spectrum for commercial mobile use. If the government is requiring existing spectrum users to vacate reallocated bands, the government also needs to establish a meaningful process for reallocating incumbent users. The process needs to begin sooner rather than later. Inventory reallocation and reallocation all take time, and commercial mobile demand for spectrum is increasing, as I mentioned earlier, exponentially. Furthermore, one way to make more spectrum available is to use government spectrum more efficiently and reallocate the spectrum that's saved. The Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, enacted in 2004, is designed to provide funding to upgrade the wireless resources of government agencies while clearing additional spectrum for commercial use. Under the CSEA, government frequencies identified for reallocation are auctioned to commercial licensees, and the proceeds are used to improve the reallocating agency's wireless facilities. The relocation procedures outlined in the CSEA worked well in most cases, but some problems have cropped up, as we all know. For example, T-Mobile paid $4.2 billion to build a 3G network. Some agencies are behind schedule in clearing some of the spectrum. However, because of unforeseen costs and complexities in their moves, problems like these may discourage participation in future relocation auctions. As you mentioned, the third bill, Truth in Caller ID Act. Millions of Americans use caller ID in order to secure greater privacy for their families. Yet, as new technologies continue to be developed, caller ID, as you mentioned, spoofing, has become a problem for consumers and businesses. This bill protects consumers by prohibiting caller ID spoofing. This occurs when a caller masquerades as someone else by falsifying the number that appears on the recipient's caller ID display and can make a call appear to come from any phone number the caller desires. Although caller ID spoofing services promote themselves for use in prank calls or for entertainment purposes only, such services can be easily accessed and used by criminals. Caller ID spoofing has emerged as a useful tool for identity thieves and other scam artists. These nefarious actions are the target of this bill. We are making some clarifying changes today that will exempt innocent carriers who simply transmit information they receive. So again, thank you for holding this hearing, and I urge passage of all three bills.
Thank you, Mr. Stearns. Now I want to recognize the subcommittee chairman who has so expeditiously and effectively handled the legislation that's been reported to us unanimously, as far as I know, on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Boucher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those kind words. This morning, our committee considers three bipartisan measures, and I want to express appreciation to our friends on the other side of the aisle for their constructive work with us as we have assembled the legislation. Two of the bills address our rapidly growing need for new wireless spectrum for mobile communications services. Every day, new, attractive, and useful applications are added to the inventory of mobile wireless services, and the bandwidth required for those applications continues to climb as features like mobile video become commonplace and as data-intensive smartphones are used by an ever larger share of the nation's population. Even with the launch this year of the fourth generation of wireless services, with LTE being deployed by major wireless carriers, and that is coming in the spectrum previously used by the television broadcasters for their analog broadcasts, within a very short period of time, substantial new spectrum for commercial wireless services will be required. Responding to this need, last July, we worked together, Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Barton, Mr. Stearns, and I, in structuring legislation that will require an inventory of the wireless spectrum by NTIA and the FCC. That measure, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act, is before the committee this morning. It requires the agencies to undertake a comprehensive survey of the nation's spectrum and report to us on current spectrum utilization, with recommendations of which, if any, of the least utilized blocks of spectrum should be reallocated for commercial use or be subjected to spectrum sharing with commercial users. The measure is a thoughtful approach to meeting the extraordinary spectrum demands that our nation will soon face. I want to express appreciation this morning to the administrator of NTIA and to his staff for their very able assistance as we made modifications to the original bill, the modifications upon which we've agreed, along with others that have also been agreed, are included in the manager's amendment that will soon be offered. And we very much look forward to continuing to work with NTIA and with other interested parties as this measure advances to the House floor to ensure that it is effective while at the same time affording appropriate protections relating to national security. I've also joined with our colleagues Jay Inslee and Fred Upton in introducing H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act. The measure would address an urgent need which was brought to light after the FCC auctioned the advanced wireless services spectrum in 2006. While that spectrum was auctioned more than 3 years ago, the winners of the commercial licenses still do not have full use of the spectrum because it has not been fully cleared of the government users. The bill would hasten the process of clearing federal users from spectrum that the government has reallocated for commercial uses. It would require the NTIA to publish the transition plan of each federal entity to be relocated after a spectrum auction. It would also clarify the steps that the federal spectrum users must take to receive payment for their relocation costs from the Spectrum Relocation Fund. I know the administration has expressed some remaining concerns about this measure, and we look forward to working closely with the administration as this measure advances to the floor in the effort to satisfy those concerns. The committee today also considers H.R. 1258, the Truth in ID Caller ID Act of 2009, introduced by Mr. Ringel and by Mr. Barton. The measure would direct the FCC to prohibit caller ID spoofing where a caller falsifies the original caller ID information during the transmission of a telephone call. The measure has passed the House on suspension during the past 2 Congresses, and we look forward to advancing it today with the goal of taking such steps as are necessary to make sure that in this Congress it is enacted into law. I want to thank Mr. Ringel and Mr. Barton for their continued commitment to this measure, and I also want to express appreciation to all members, including our friends on the other side of the aisle, for their very constructive work and contributions and their support of the 3 items of legislation we're considering this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boucher. Members will now have 3 minutes for an opening statement if they wish to take the time. Without objection, all opening statements will be included in the record in their entirety.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pitts, you seek recognition for opening statement. Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling today's markup on these important bills. My remarks are going to center on H.R. 3125, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act, and H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act. As the founder and co-chairman of the Congressional Electronic Warfare Working Group for the past 10 years, I believe that the electromagnetic spectrum is critically important to our current and future military operations. I'm pleased to see that the committee has taken into consideration concerns raised by the administration and the electronic warfare community regarding public disclosure of national security information, the reallocation process, and to some extent, the amount of spectrum included in the inventory. However, the electromagnetic spectrum is a dynamic and ever-changing environment, and we must ensure that our armed forces can manage utilization of the spectrum and provide long-term strategic planning and program development. While I understand the importance and the potential economic value of spectrum inventory and reallocation, it is vital that these bills take into account the criticality of the electromagnetic spectrum to military training and operations and the importance of the U.S. military controlling the spectrum in conflict. In addition, it is also imperative that it is recognized that the electromagnetic spectrum is considered a global warfighting domain that is fundamental to the range of military operations. Its availability is essential to existing and emerging technologies in electronic warfare, network-centric capabilities, communication systems, satellite resources, and multi-spectral sensors. To that end, I would like to thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Boucher for working with me to include report language in H.R. 3125 that recognizes the critical importance of adequate spectrum allocations for our armed services. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and your staff going forward. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. I now want to recognize Chairman Emeritus Dingell, who will have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I support the legislation before the committee. I commend you and the subcommittee chairman and the members of the subcommittees for their work done. I have a splendid opening statement, which I know everyone will enjoy reading, and so I ask unanimous consent that it be inserted in the record.
And without objection, that'll be the order. Thank you. Further recognition with Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for taking up this bill regarding phone harassment. And I just want to give the committee some history on this. I first introduced this actually in the 109th Congress, and it passed the full House. After the 109th Congress, I reintroduced this with Chairman Bobby Scott, and it passed then the 110th Congress, and actually we did another version, the 111th Congress, but it provided criminal penalties for caller ID spoofing. On the one hand, sometimes this is mere harassment, a famous case where Paris Hilton had used Lindsay Lohan's caller ID number to get into her voicemail, but there's a lot of times when it is more than just harassment. The police and the FBI refer to this as swatting, where someone will use another person's caller ID, call the police, claim a crime is in process, and the police and SWAT teams show up, Luckily, no one has been harmed in these cases, but you can imagine what can happen if a team of police with guns shows up on the spot where they think a crime is happening, or someone has a gun, or a kidnapping, or someone else is taking place. Indeed, there are dozens of examples where this has appeared across America, and I hope we can pass this bill into law before someone gets hurt. There are also times, for example, at the beginning of March, a woman from Pennsylvania discovered her phone number had been appearing in other people's caller IDs. Someone had been using this to harass other people using her phone number. There's also cases where the Virginia State Police warned citizens to be vigilant against scam artists using phony caller ID numbers to obtain donations for Haitian refugees. Last December, another case in Pennsylvania occurred where a woman was claiming to have shot her baby to death. Turned out to be a hoax. The police and detectives were forced to spend their Christmas Day wasting valuable resources investigating what was presented as a gruesome crime that never appeared to be committed. There are multiple other cases of this, and I worry if the House and Senate do not pass this bill, there will be other times that will eventually end up in tragedy. I urge my colleagues not only to move this from committee, and not only to move this from the House, and not only move this from the Senate, but please get this to the President's desk and let the citizens of America know that when their caller ID shows up, they have the right to know if that call is unsafe, unknown, or unwanted. This is a tragedy waiting to be committed here if we do not make sure that caller ID numbers are honest and straightforward. Again, I call upon all members of this committee to pass a bill that we have looked at from the 109th, 110th, and 111th Congress to make sure that our citizens are safe and make sure that they know that the truth in caller ID is really going to prevent criminals from being able to steal or mask or alter one caller identification to deceive victims. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to place my full statement in record, but I would, all three of the bills are very good bills, but I'd like to particularly talk about H.R. 1258, the Truth in Caller ID Act of 2009 is an important bill, and I've taken an interest in it, and the committee marked up the legislation last Congress. Caller ID is a great benefit to millions of Americans by giving them control over their telephones and who and when they talk on the phone. Like many technological advances, caller ID is a benefit, but bad actors can take advantage of it and turn the technology against the people who it's supposed to help. We want certain people to be able to mask caller ID information for good purposes, like protecting abused women, children, or anonymous whistleblowers, but you do not want people to be able to obtain it for deceptive purposes. Last Congress, I had several concerns about the bill that did not go far enough to address an issue that arose in Texas with robocalls that were using misleading caller ID information. I worked with Mr. Engel on an amendment to address that. Every election year, there are reports of abusive and deceptive political robocalls, and recently reports claimed that some of these calls use deceptive caller ID information. We don't want to limit someone's free political speech. And why should we allow someone to call voters with a fake caller ID info that they're claiming they're the local Democrat or Republican Party when they're really not? We also do not want those automated calls to use innocent businesses' caller ID info, which causes the people to blame these businesses instead of the real source of the calls. This bill, particularly the amendment in the nature of a substitute, addresses that and strengthens the previous language, and I applaud the bill's sponsor for strengthening it. It's a good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support unanimously as we refer to the House. And again, Mr. Chairman, I have a full statement I'd like to place in the record.
Without objection, that will be the order. Thank you, Mr. Green. The Chair would like to now recognize the ranking member of the full committee for 5 minutes, Mr. Barton.
It won't take 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to be a sponsor of one of these bills, the Truth in Caller ID Act, and that's the reason I came, is just to make sure you know that I am an original sponsor. But you still want to mark the bill up. It's since it's Truth in Caller ID, we need to have truth in original co-sponsorship too. These are three good bills. They've all been done on a bipartisan basis. Mr. Stearns and Mr. Boucher have worked very well at the subcommittee, and hopefully the full committee will go just as well. So I'm putting my statement in the record, but it's good to have a markup where we haven't been up all night killing trees to create amendments to cause problems. So we appreciate this cooperation. I yield Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. I just wanted to take 15 seconds to let members know that another incident occurred where an organization was using my House of Representatives office number to make calls on a phony caller ID, and I wanted to alert members that that is not illegal. I mean, I think it's illegal from pretending you're a federal office, but they were able to obtain this. We couldn't track that down, and they were calling and harassing constituents, so I wanted members to know that, too. Another reason why to make this illegal. Thank you.
Terrible. Anyway,
Your
thank
staff told you it was a phony deal, not your office? Not our office. It wasn't your office? Okay, thank you.
No, sir, it was in our office.
Good, thank you.
I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Harmon, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me applaud the tone of this markup and the content. These bills are at the heart of efficient radio spectrum management. Spectrum is a precious and finite resource. We need to use it wisely and protect it. I have for years championed the use of dedicated spectrum for first responders, and proper management is the way to get there. We must think about the radio spectrum the same way we do other natural resources like air and water. If Mr. Barton's here, I hope he heard what I said. We need to have a full understanding of the spectrum landscape, which the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act is designed to give us. This bill will help identify how and where spectrum is being used and the frequencies that are claimed but not being used. That leads to the second bill, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act. The federal government is the largest holder of spectrum and auctioned off a host of frequencies to independent commercial and shared private-public use, but the government has been slow to relocate its spectrum to the winners. This bill will require the National Telecommunications and Information Agency to make transition plans for this complex process before the next spectrum auction. Let's not forget what happened to the D-block auction in 2008, something I was very close to. That was supposed to allocate additional spectrum for first responders' use. The prices were too high for what the spectrum was actually worth, and no one bought anything. This bill will help add clarity and prevent that from happening again. And finally, the committee is taking up a bill that anyone who's gotten a telemarketing call during dinner will appreciate. The Truth in Caller ID Act will make it illegal for a caller to spoof his number on your caller ID, that is, to intentionally conceal who it is that's actually calling. Spoofing will only get easier as more calls are moved to easily manipulated Internet services. Mr. Chairman, this committee is doing its work today, and I really want to applaud a successful and bipartisan markup. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Harmon. Further recognition? Mr. Burgess.
Mr. Chairman, I will just submit my statement for the record.
Without objection, it'll be put into the record. Gentlelady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for the markup today. And just briefly, a word on the spectrum issue. We're all waiting for the broadband plan to be announced next week from the FCC, but I'm glad that we're moving ahead with the issue of spectrum and spectrum inventory and spectrum relocation today. I think that is important. It's crucial that we have a better handle on what is happening with the spectrum and how it is being used and how we need to utilize it. So I am appreciative of that. I'm also appreciative that these bills don't focus on the politics, but rather call on the engineers to give us an honest and thorough assessment of the spectrum availability, which is a great starting point as the debate over the broadband plan will begin and as it continues and moves forward. I think it's also important that as we have this discussion and look at these bills and look at our spectrum relocation, we realize that even according to GAO, 80% of the American consumers are happy. They're pleased with their wireless service. And so it is ample motivation for us to get as much information as we possibly can about the spectrum availability and evaluate all of the options that are going to be before us. So thank you for this and for the hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Inslee?
Thank you. I just think we should declare a national day of celebration because we actually have a bipartisan bill that helps government work better, and I want to applaud our Republican colleagues, Mr. Upton, working on this 3019, the spectrum bill that we've worked on, and Chairman Waxman and Boucher and Ranking Members Barton and Stearns and everyone. This is a success. It does help, in fact, government work better by increasing the quality of information available for bidders in the spectrum. It expedites flow of auction proceeds. It's a common sense thing that makes government work better, and I look forward to working with the National Telecommunications and Information administration and the rest of my colleagues to continue if folks have ideas on how to continue to perfect it, as the chair talked about. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. Yes, gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for calling today's markup on these three pieces of legislation. They've all been considered by the Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and the Internet. I would also like to commend you for working with Ranking Member Barton and minority members of the committee to craft these bills. Mr. Chairman, all three of these bills represent the spirit of comity and level of effectiveness that can occur when we work in a bipartisan fashion on these important telecommunications issues. As we progress through the rest of the year, I do certainly hope that this trend of bipartisanship will continue. H.R. 3125, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act, addresses one of the biggest issues facing the telecommunications industry and what FCC Chairman Janikowski called a looming spectrum crisis that could undermine the future advances in mobile broadband. This important legislation will simply require that NTIA and the FCC to develop an inventory of each spectrum band of frequency. With this inventory, we will get a better sense of what is already being utilized and what is available for our future use. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act, seeks to improve the process of clearing off federal users from spectrum that has been reallocated or auctioned off for commercial use. I applaud our committee colleagues, Chairman Boucher, Mr. Inslee, and Mr. Upton, for working to craft legislation that will inevitably help expedite the completion of future spectrum auctions. In the spectrum auction conducted in 2006, the FCC gained $13.7 billion, but unfortunately there were numerous delays in removing users from the spectrum and thus incurring additional costs. H.R. 3019 seeks to make this a much simpler process by requiring NTIA to make publicly available the transition plan for federal users, thereby adding transparency to the process. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1258, the Truth in Caller ID Act, would make it a crime under the Communications Act to manipulate technology to falsify ID information that's being sent to the recipient of a call. With the rise in practice of spoofing caller ID information, particularly as voice over internet protocol, that technology has made it easier to spoof information, and I am pleased to see that H.R. 1258 will address this matter in a simple way. Mr. Chairman, all three bills under consideration by the full committee today are the product of strong and successful bipartisan work. I look forward to reporting H.R. 3125, H.R. 3019, and H.R. 1258 back to the full House. It's my hope that these bills will soon be considered on the House floor. I urge my colleagues to support these bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back his time. Any further requests for time for opening statement? Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Barton for having this markup. I applaud both of you as well as Mr. Boucher and Mr. Stearns for your bipartisan work on this legislation before us today. One of the most pressing issues facing technology industries is the availability and use of spectrum, especially given the dramatic increase we're seeing in use of wireless services. As wireless technologies continue to advance and more Americans use mobile devices for data-intensive purposes, the demand for spectrum will grow rapidly. Additional spectrum will be needed, and soon. I'm sure many in the industry would already be able to take advantage of that spectrum if it was available today. Today, our committee takes critical steps in helping meet these challenges. Both H.R. 3125, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act, and H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act, are important bills that will help promote and advance effective and efficient use of spectrum. The first step must be identifying which spectrum is available and how the spectrum is currently being utilized, and the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act will do just that by requiring NTIA and FCC to undertake a comprehensive survey of the nation's spectrum and develop an inventory. I'm pleased to see that the bill also identifies the types of services provided and the amount of use of each band on a geographic basis. This will help us understand what bands are being used ineffectively and what areas of the country are lacking the use of wireless services and the benefits they provide. Taking this inventory is the only way we'll be able to know what spectrum can be relocated and what spectrum can be shared or used in a more efficient manner. We'll then be able to decide the best ways to utilize the spectrum and where needed, relocate it. Unfortunately, this process will take time, which is not good for an industry that changes and develops so rapidly. We have seen delays and problems resulting from the last auction. Agencies have been behind schedule on clearing spectrum, and unforeseen costs and complexities have arisen. We do not want these problems to discourage future participation in broadband auctions and relocations. We need to improve the relocation process, and the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act will help achieve this goal, requiring the NTIA to publish a transition plan, clarifying the steps users must take to receive payment for their relocation costs, and placing a time requirement on this process will facilitate relocation and make this process better for future auctions. Finally, we have seen an unsettling rise in technologies and services that allow individuals who wish to deceive others through caller ID manipulation to do so very easily. Spoofing, as it is known, not only creates public safety concerns, but also threatens business applications that rely on telephone numbers as part of their verification and authentication process. I'm pleased that Mr. Engel and Mr. Barton have brought the Truth in Caller ID Act forward. This legislation will help protect consumers and vital business services and hopefully prevent the use of proliferation of spoofing. Mr. Chairman, I want to close by saying that the technology industry and the wireless industry in particular have been very successful, and there are industries that continue to invest in new technologies and infrastructure and continue to create good jobs even during tough economic times. We certainly don't want to do anything to discourage that job creation. We do not want to delay the expansion of wireless broadband services or put impediments in place that will hinder efforts to utilize spectrum more efficiently and effectively. We want to facilitate investments in these technologies so that consumers can continue to benefit from them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any other opening statements that members wish to give? If not, let's proceed to the legislation. The chair calls up H.R. 3125, the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act. The version before the committee is this H.R. 3125 as amended by the Subcommittee on Communications Technology and the Internet. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I would now like to recognize Mr. Boucher for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of the substitute, a manager's amendment at the desk.
Without objection, that amendment will be considered as read, and gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute reflects recommendations that we've received from a wide array of interested parties, and it also incorporates suggestions that have been made by members on both sides of the aisle during the course of the subcommittee consideration and in the time intervening since that markup. And I want to express appreciation particularly to our Republican colleagues for the constructive work that we've all undertaken together in order to structure the manager's amendment. It makes the following key changes. It lengthens from 2 to 4 years the time within which the agencies make recommendations to Congress for spectrum reallocations and requirements for spectrum sharing in recognition of the fact that the agencies simply need time in order to perform the complex evaluations that will underlie these recommendations. It provides that the spectrum inventory extend from 225 megahertz to 3.7 gigahertz and then extend up to as much as 10 gigahertz. But the extension to 10 gigahertz would only occur upon a finding that the benefit of that extension outweighs its cost. Under this amendment, the agencies would be required to explain why, in their view, the benefit does not outweigh the cost if on 3 successive occasions the agencies decide not to extend the inventory all the way to 10 gigahertz. And the amendment revises the national security portions of the bill to include a consultative role for the National Security Council in determining what information about spectrum use should be publicly withheld. It also allows agency heads to decide that non-disclosure of spectrum held outside their own agency holdings could, under certain circumstances, be deemed damaging to national security and be withheld. I again want to thank all members for the coordinated work we've done in structuring this manager's amendment, and I urge its adoption by the committee.
Gentlemen, yield to me. This is an amendment that has been agreed to by all the participants in the legislation as a manager's amendment. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Is there discussion? If not, let's proceed to the vote. All those in favor of the Boucher amendment in the nature of a substitute say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. Are there further amendments to the legislation?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman, Mr. Boyer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we had a hearing on this issue and subsequent markup, I brought up an issue about making sure that the contracts that between the commercial user and the federal government, that we honor those contracts. So, Mr. Boucher, you brought up this issue, the fact in the last auction, there's spectrum that still has not yet been cleared. And first I thought what maybe we should do is begin to penalize government and begin to reward, Mr. Waxman, these...
Gentlemen, yield to me.
Yes.
I believe you might be referring to what's in the next bill. So if you withhold...
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Which one are you doing first?
We're doing the Spectrum, the H.R.
Right.
31
I withdraw.
by the radio spectrum inventory.
I'm eager.
Gentleman will be recognized again on his very important point. Any further discussion? The motion now comes to report H.R. 3125 as amended with a recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The chair now calls up...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I just asked that the minority, pursuant to the rules, be granted the requisite number of days to submit comments on the bill just reported.
Without objection, that will be the order. Chair now calls up H.R. 3019, the Spectrum Relocation Improvement Act. This version before the committee is the bill as introduced. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I want to recognize Mr. Boyer at this point on this issue.
Thank you. So long as you strike everything I said from the record on the last bill. What we were hoping to do is make sure that we had fidelity with our contracts. And you know, I tried to be as creative. We explored the idea of, well, maybe we should start paying interest to these companies if we're not going to clear. I appreciate Mr. Boucher and your staff working with me. And then we thought about this idea of trying to provide incentives to agencies to clear, and what type of percentage then would you give to an agency to clear. And in the end, I just couldn't figure it out. Because you could actually have a situation whereby you give incentives to certain agencies to clear, yet the same agencies that continue to be the problem, whether it's DOD or Homeland Security or Department of Justice, can still then apply for waivers. So money moves out there to clear, and we still don't have the cleared spectrum. So this idea of trying to incentivize agencies seemed to be just sort of a bridge too far. I want to compliment the 1 year and trying to give assurances out there that we're trying to ensure that these contracts are honored. I believe that the executive branch bears the responsibility and authority to use all resources available in ensuring the relocating agencies honor their contracts. So I'm not going to offer the amendment. I appreciate, Mr. Boucher, your staff working with me on report language that spells out our interest, our intent of the legislation, and I want to thank you for doing that. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Are there any amendments to the legislation? If not, the motion now is to order reported H.R. 3019 with a recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to, and the minority will have the requisite amount of time for filing any other views.
Thank you.
We now consider H.R. 1258, the Truth in Caller ID Act, sponsored by Representative Engel and others. The version before the committee is H.R. 1258 as amended by the Subcommittee on Communications Technology and the Internet. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there, Mr. Boucher?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute for the legislation.
Without objection, that amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment really only makes one change. It adds spoofing with the intent to deceive to the conduct that is prohibited under the legislation. That clarification ensures that the measure encompasses deceptive activity, whether or not there is an intent on the part of the perpetrator to cause harm. This amendment has been approved by interested parties who have examined the measure, including our friends in the minority. I thank them for their cooperation. Let me also just take this opportunity to commend both Mr. Engel and Mr. Barton for their persistent work on this measure. Hopefully in this Congress we'll see the enactment of the legislation they've pursued now for many years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me, before we consider the amendment, the nature of a substitute, ask unanimous consent that the language changing the title of the bill be considered a part of the bill's text. Without objection, that'll be the order. Any further discussion of the amendment, the nature of a substitute offered by Representative Boucher?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Engel.
Yes. Do I need to move to strike the last word?
No, you can be recognized on the amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support Mr. Boucher's change, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your interest in the bill and for calling today's markup. I want to thank Mr. Boucher. I want Mr. Barton, Mr. Stearns. I'm here in strong support of my legislation, the Truth in Caller ID Act. This has been, as Mr. Boucher said, a bipartisan matter, and Mr. Stearns and my classmate and has been very helpful, and all the way down everybody has agreed that this is something long coming. I introduced the bill because we needed an immediate change in our laws to help prevent identity theft, to crack down on fraudulent phone calls, and to protect legitimate uses of caller ID technology. Last year, over 6,000 people were victimized by credit card fraud and identity theft. Criminals stole over $15 million from banks and ruined the credits of thousands of victims. They were able to perpetrate this fraud in some instances by using caller ID spoofing. The disturbing fact about spoofing is not just that it's legal, but how easy it is to carry out. Criminals use a tool called a spoof card to change their outgoing caller ID and even to disguise their voice in order to trick banks into giving them access to their victims' accounts. You can have a male or a female voice, and you can disguise all these things with the technology that's around today, and it just ought to stop. This tool is available to anyone with access to a web browser. No one can dispute that the legislation is necessary. Last year, a person in New York called a pregnant woman who she viewed as a romantic rival, spoofing the phone number of the woman's pharmacist. She tricked the woman into taking a drug used to cause abortions. Caller ID fraud has been used to prank call the constituents of a member of this body with the caller ID readout saying it came from that member's office. Just imagine if people committed this fraud in the days leading up to a close election. So in response to this problem, I, along with Mr. Barton, have introduced the Truth in Caller ID Act. The bill outlaws the deceptive use of caller ID spoofing technology if the intention of the caller is to deceive the recipient of the call. This bill does not change the rules for legitimate uses of the technology. For example, a domestic abuse shelter will still be able to change their number on caller ID to protect the occupants of the shelter. So I am pleased in conclusion that the bill passed both this committee and the full House by voice vote in the 109th and 110th Congresses, and I look forward to its passage in the committee again today and hope the other body will pass it as well. And I urge my colleagues very strongly to support the Truth in Caller ID Act and outlaw this type of fraud once and for all. And I yield back, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Further discussion or amendments to the amendment that's pending in the nature of a substitute? Seeing no member seeking recognition, I now call the vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Representative Boucher. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'd like to now move to order reported H.R. 1258 as amended with a recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor of reporting the bill say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. I'd like to ask unanimous consent for all three bills that the staff make technical and conforming changes, which is the usual kind of UC that we have under these circumstances. And Mr. Stearns, do you wish to make a request for the minority?
I ask that the minority, pursuant to the rules, be granted the requisite number of days to submit comments on the bill just reported.
Without objection, that will be the order. That concludes our business for today. I thank all the members for their participation, and we stand adjourned.